It's Monday, January 6th, 2020. And today, Tommy and I talk with Bo George about productivity as it relates to giving users guest access to Office 365. I hope you enjoy this. Hello, and welcome to the Work Together Better podcast. I'm here today with Bo George. Hey, Bo.
Hey, Danny. Hey, Tommy.
Hey,
And
Bill.
Tommy Ryan. Hey, Tom.
Howdy, Danny.
Welcome back. We're just coming back from the holidays and started up a new year here. And this is actually a follow-up podcast on Office 365 and giving guests access. I think what Tommy and I recognized was that maybe it would be good to pull in a couple of three-wheel experts to this particular topic. And so from the productivity side of things, we're pulling in Bo George for some more details around things. Bo will probably end up do this more often this year as Tommy and I have fewer answers to the questions. Just pull you guys in as we need, if that's okay.
That's cool with me. Yeah.
Excellent. So the follow-up to the conversation where we were talking about, sort of what we've been doing a lot on projects with regards to giving guest access, and wanted you to find out from you sort of some of the things that are the important topics from the standpoint of productivity. Can you sort of get us kicked off with what some things maybe that you've seen going on in projects and what as it relates to productivity?
Sure. So, guest access, there's a lot to it. But in terms of SharePoint productivity, specifically in SharePoint productivity and guest users access versus a tenant-based users access is almost exactly the same. I mean, if you give a guest user access to your site to be an owner, a contributor, or a visitor, it's going to be the same as a tenant user, which is great inside of SharePoint proper. So, and then Teams, similar experience. Guest users are really pretty much first class citizens in a team and can do all the normal stuff other members of that team can do. I think when you get into some of the other products is where the water gets a little bit more muddy in terms of stuff like the Power Platform and Stream and some of those things that get layered into those products. But SharePoint proper, it's been awesome in terms of being able to collaborate with people as a guest user. So
it's pretty straightforward from a SharePoint standpoint, but then when you start looking, so they nailed that, but there's some other things that we'll probably have to take a look at as we're starting using other products from Microsoft.
Yeah, it's the historical Microsoft and licensing conundrum that hits everybody. And it being a guest in somebody else's tenant only exacerbates that conundrum. So
okay, cool. Well, tell me a little bit more about what are the concerns with regards to licensing?
So SharePoint itself is really good as a collaboration platform, and with a lot of our customers, we've built a lot of intranets. And obviously, as soon as you start building an intranet in today's world, you're going to probably want video. And so with customers, we've had that video conversation. If everybody that's going to your intranet is a part of your tenant, video seems a pretty simple thing. If you have Stream licensed, put them in Stream, then they're secured to your tenant and people show them.
Yeah.
But if you're an organization where maybe you have guest users, maybe you're a multi-tenant organization and you have users in another tenant, that question gets a little bit more slippery. And so a lot of those customers, it may be that you continue to do videos in YouTube or private channels or Vimeo, where there's sort of a very complex link that's not easily discoverable. A lot of companies have been doing that for their corporate communication portals.
Okay.
And so that all still works in SharePoint, and that's like a stopgap for Stream licensing in that case.
Okay.
We did Will Holland, I have to give him a shout out. When we were at Ignite this past November, we went to the Stream team with that question, and they did tell us that next year, well, now it's this year, they were going to be adding like anonymous links for Stream so that it could be opened up and stuff like that. So I know that Microsoft has heard the guest challenge with Stream, and I think they're working towards it to making that better. So
excellent, excellent. What other apps are you noticing things that you had to work around?
Power Platform's another big one. Some things will work for people in the Power Platform, like as a user, as a guest user, I can run flows. If I add a list item and a flow has to run behind that, then that should work fine. But say you have a Power app that you built as a Canvas app, that
Mhm.
won't work for guest users because of the licensing. So regardless of in my tenant that I have access to the Power Platform, I go into in somebody else's and then I can't use it. So that's a challenge. Now Microsoft is addressing that there's sort of two types of Power Apps. There's the ones that are your Canvas app. They're sort of a full blown. And then there's the ones where you've customized a SharePoint list form.
Uh-huh.
And that happens quite a bit. And the scenario where you customize a SharePoint list form is one that they're working to support. I don't know. It's coming out pretty soon, but that one would be like if you have a SharePoint list and you've put a really fancy form on top of that list entry, then that will work for guests soon, if not already. I had to look at the roadmap for that one. So
Awesome.
that's another biggie that seems to come up. That was I tripped over that one like a year and a half ago for a customer where I built a Power App and then they said, "Hey, we have a bunch of guest users." I was like, "Uh-oh." So
And it looks like, I guess, from project work as well, you've got you guys have sort of picked up this. Your Will's created a spreadsheet, sort of like the different features that are out there. And boy, this sounds like something maybe we could. I know Will's been putting some blog posts out, but this might be a good little downloadable off of our site. But tell me more about what that is.
yeah, we'll like for one of our customers who's a multi-tenant, Will invested a good bit of time using his developer tenant and then like his 3Will account accessing that as a guest to really get to the meat of what happens when you're a guest using applications in somebody else's tenant, and
Uh-huh.
what's that experience like, what are the potholes and all that sort of stuff. So that spreadsheet he did it was really awesome, and I look back at it quite a bit. Sometimes it's licensing will change and affect it, but it's really robust for hey, I'm a guest user, I'm opening an Excel document that's over in my customer's tenant. What does that mean? And it's going to actually use my Office apps permissions, or my Outlook, or I mean not my Outlook, but my Excel or Word clients. It's going to open in mine, so I might get prompted to log in again or whatever. So there's certain things with Office apps that will use your license within your tenant and your products. And then there's things like the Power Apps, and then there's just normal SharePoint stuff or the Admin Center. We are oftentimes a SharePoint administrator in our customer's tenant, so he vetted that stuff to see, well, what's that like. And then obviously we talked about Stream. He even went so far as to talk about Kaizala, which really doesn't seem to have a guest component to it. And I think maybe one day that'll just get rolled into Teams. And then, of course, Teams is another one. Probably that might be the most common guest user experience that people encounter, because as soon as
Yeah.
somebody sets up a team, they want to collaborate with somebody external. Works great for us. So he looked at all those features and all the things that get layered on top of a team, a planner board and things like that. And so, you can be assigned tasks as a guest in somebody's tenant in the planner board and edit those and things like that. So that spreadsheet's pretty robust, well thought through, and a really great job from Will putting that together.
I'll have to follow up with him, see if maybe that's a downloadable resource for us. It sounds like it could be really helpful. And it's probably something we need to keep up to date as well.
Yeah, the licensing roadmap will continue to evolve. So
Yeah. You almost want to wrap that with a blog post and say,
Yeah.
put comments below if you see anything that is out of date. We want to keep it up to date.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Tell me a little bit. I know we're not really focusing in on security, but tell me a little bit about Azure AD groups and how that plays into this.
Yeah, that one was really top of mind with guest access because I was thinking about multi-tenants.
Uh-huh.
And in particular, coming from the mindset that you're building an intranet or a digital workplace on Office 365 in SharePoint,
Mm-hmm.
and where where Azure AD groups are really valuable are that it gives you sort of that single point of control. So with my team who manages Azure AD, I could create an Azure AD group and call it employees, right? And that could actually literally represent people in multiple tenants if we're in a sort of a converging multi-tenant scenario and everybody's not in the same tenant yet. And so you can have guest users in there, and they can be in your Azure AD groups and Office 365 groups in there, security or Office 365 groups. And you can also have your tenant users. And what I like about that is then when I'm securing, say I'm securing the leadership site, and in that site, I want to give access to leaders who are a member of multiple tenants. Maybe some are from one and some are for the other. Well, I can rely on that Azure AD group for the security, and I'm not, adding Bo at company one and Bob at acme.com and all that sort of stuff. It centralizes your control around security, which is the ideal scenario for that sort of stuff. So Azure AD groups are a great way to bridge that gap and manage your users in a centralized place, and then use those groups inside of SharePoint. And what's really awesome about those is features that really started rolling out towards the end of the third quarter, fourth quarter, audience targeting. I think everybody has it now. Well, those can be used for that as well. So, it's with that same mindset of the employees group, say you have a contractors and an employees, and those span multiple tenants. Well, then I could target content to employees by using the employee Azure AD security group. And that means employee at company A, B, or C, tenant A, B, or C, would see content that maybe contractor at A, B, or C wouldn't see. So another great reason to leverage Azure AD groups.
Yeah, that sounds like it not only helps with onboarding new people, but also with offboarding people as well.
Right.
Doing some of the cleanup. If it's all there in Azure AD, then you're getting them out. You can point to one place for them, and then you're not making user accounts across a bunch of different places, and sort of have one place to go to keep everything up to date, which is definitely probably easier to maintain security that way. What other sort of like guest considerations that are out there?
Well, this tiptoes into security a little bit, but
that's fine. You can step on Pete's toes. I'm fine.
Yeah,
I'm sure
Pete will have to find something else to talk about. But in thinking about putting myself in the shoes of sort of a SharePoint administrator or even an Azure AD administrator, one of their concerns is how far do I open up sharing, right? And there's 4 knobs that Microsoft gives you at a tenant level. So you can say, well, you can share with anyone, and that could be like a Gmail account, a Hotmail account, or you can say, well, new and existing people. Or excuse me, anyone would even be like an anonymous link, but new and existing means, hey, even if this person isn't a guest in my tenant yet, I could share with them, they could accept it, and then it sort of creates a guest account in the tenant. So there's that new and existing. And then there's existing only that says, hey, they have to exist in our tenant as a guest before you can share with them. And then our org only. So those 4 knobs are really important when you consider the impacts on things like SharePoint and Teams, where customers we've worked with they typically end up in the new and existing scenario because if you don't do that, then every time you have a team and you want to invite a guest, you've got to go to your IT organization to say add Bo's 3-wheel account so that he can be invited to this team, and that becomes a hassle, right? So that's why people typically end up in the new and existing scenario. But that's at a tenant level, and customers have kind of settled there often for Teams and the openness of collaboration there. Now, if you layer that down to a site level inside of SharePoint, you're going to have an intranet, typically used for communication. So what you can still do at your site level is you can ratchet that back a little bit and say, oh, actually for my intranet, I want it to be org only. So you can't invite guests to these intranet sites. Or if you're a multi-tenant, you might say, well, existing only. And in that scenario, you're a little bit tighter secured on your intranet sites. than your tenant is, because maybe your internet sites probably are going to have a little bit more sensitive information than a team, right? Or at least information that you don't want to leak. So existing only would then allow you to control it to say, well, you know, if I want to invite Bo to this particular intranet site, he has to exist in my directory already, and if he doesn't, then that can't happen. You know, there's still some leakage potentially there because you invited somebody to Teams, they ended up in your tenant, and you got to worry about that scenario. And that's where sort of my thought is the third prong of that approach is to leverage the security and compliance center, and have alerts for when sharing to guests is done, and it's specifically for the sites that you're most concerned about. So you could ignore, you know, the sites that are backing your teams maybe because you're all right with those being open, but maybe your intranet sites or specific intranet sites, you can say, make sure this isn't shared with anybody that doesn't end with these domains. And you can, you know, have PowerShell and jobs to kind of monitor that, because you get stuck in a open risky situation just by the nature of those having those two sets of 4 levels granularity a little bit. So you have to be aware of it and careful with it.
Good deal. What else? What else do we need to consider as we look at this?
Well, some areas of concern that customers have had when we were talking about multi-tenants were oftentimes it was audiences. Can people access the content? Which I think inside of SharePoint, like I've never been happier that SharePoint does stuff better than other products inside of Microsoft. You know, the licensing doesn't seem to come in play there. So what I think is awesome about that is, you know, I can be a guest in a customer's tenant. They can make me a SharePoint admin and I can help them manage their farm, or they can just make me maybe a site collection admin or a site owner. So the permissions are great there. So I think it's a good story for intranets. I hope stuff like Stream and Power Apps and stuff like that come along. Microsoft Forms, thinking of another product, that one's pretty wide open. You can already share Microsoft Forms with anyone outside of your tenant even. So those are a good way to layer in stuff like surveys or questions. We have a customer we're working with now that uses a lot of Microsoft Forms combined with Flow to, you know, fill out maybe an event request or things like that, and then have it feed into a SharePoint list. So,
gotcha.
So
go ahead, Tommy.
I was say, yeah, I was going through your notes, Bo, and you had a comment around team walls. What's this team walls all about?
I knew that one would stir you. So this is not as fresh in my memory, but it's kind of the inverse of it. It's so at Ignite, I saw it at least twice, or at least maybe I heard it once and then saw it once. But a team wall, if that's the right term for what they're calling it, is, say you're in a highly what's the right word? Highly sensitive environment. I haven't worked in those, so I don't know. But the scenario they said was, say you're like a stock company or whatever, and you don't want 2 traders to talk because maybe it actually opens you up to risk to insider trading or something like that, right? And you actually want to create a virtual wall between the two so that they can't use your technology to talk. Now, obviously, if they wander by the water cooler and talk, you can't really stop that. But at least your technology and Teams, you can make it where they can't talk. And so what they showed is you could set up these boundaries and say, hey, you know, Bo's in bucket A and bucket A is not allowed to talk to bucket B, and Tommy's in bucket B. And then inside of Teams, when I tried to chat with Tommy, it actually acts like he doesn't even exist and I can't talk to him. And I thought that was kind of an interesting scenario to say, you know, I haven't been in those banking or maybe securities and exchange kind of things, but it makes a lot of sense. And that way, as a company, you can say, hey, we put up the wall where these two couldn't talk, so we, you know, if some of this has gone on, it's those guys outside of work or whatever, you know, we haven't enabled it, we've actually disabled it. So
that's interesting. I know Coca-Cola, I believe, acquired Dr. Pepper, and they were trying to keep their information separate. So there's value, and if they spun off Dr. Pepper, people would know that information, the secret sauce of that product line was never seen by Coke. It's just owned by Coke. I don't know if there's a lot of scenarios like that, but it allows you to maybe keep this organization that maybe you're temporarily holding, and treat it as though it's a separate company, and create, some barriers to not allow, information to leak.
Yeah, it was hearing it was there. I think the reason it stuck in my head is because everything with collaboration tends to be openness and conversation with each other and all that sort of stuff. So to see Microsoft demonstrate at Ignite and talk about it Ignite, a way to put up walls to collaboration means that somebody cares about it enough that Microsoft developed it for Teams, and maybe they're exploring it further, but it is weird because it's the antithesis of collaboration,
Yeah, you've got I think one of the companies that we work with, there's a parent company and then a bunch of companies underneath that. And some of those companies compete with each other. So you've got to, even though you have a central IT, you can't have them sharing information across companies. So, and probably in some of these highly regulated industries, you run into scenarios like that as well. So it's interesting, yeah, that they include this as one of the features that they're focusing in on that. That's great to see.
Well, I don't know why, but the visual it puts in my head is like a horse where they put those blinders on both sides so they can only see forward to run forward. They don't know who's beside them or whatever's going on. Just go forward. That's all you need to worry about.
I've got one last question here, and Tommy, I'll check with you, see if you have anything to follow up. What are we seeing? So we're talking in this case about giving guest access. And so when I start thinking about that, I start thinking at a high level, what are a lot of our clients doing with that? Are they giving guest access to partners, to vendors, to customers, to like, what do we see? Is there anything that we're seeing sort of the trend wise with regards to how people are using this? And right away, I start thinking, like, as soon as I'm giving somebody access outside of my company, I start thinking, oh, we're moving from an intranet to an extranet type of thing. And it sounds like nowadays it's like there isn't such a clear distinguishing, like your intranet, like people are sort of melding the two together. And I might be wrong with that, but it just sort of sounds like that's how things are going. Your intranet, you might have portions of it that where you do give access to people outside your organization. Anything you're seeing as far as like who are people are starting to provide to access? Are we sort of seeing, is it starting with customers? Is it starting with partners, with vendors? What are we seeing anything there as far as trends?
So yeah, I think the lines between an intranet and an extranet are for sure blurring.
Okay.
And Microsoft also with guest access, one thing that I didn't mention at all is they call it B2C and B2B.
Okay.
And I would certainly say, especially with Teams, and at least in our experience, but I'm seeing it with others, that B2B sort of scenarios where us and our three-wheel tenant are collaborating with customers in their Azure tenants. That's like a very common thing. And I think it's led by Teams, which Teams are backed by a SharePoint site. So there's aspects of that. And then in terms of actual what I call quote unquote intranets, which that's running in SharePoint typically, which is also the backing side of Teams and that whole thing. But intranets, there are some extranet parts of that, but it tends to probably be specific site collections and maybe not holistically the entirety of the intranet.
Okay.
Which that feeds into another feature coming from Microsoft that I think is important, which is I mentioned audience targeting earlier, and currently that's available for news articles and site pages and things like that, where you can say, hey, this content is targeted to these people. And soon, I think this quarter, they're going to have that for navigation. And that's good because you're going to have stuff like hub navigation that spans sites. And if you have a guest in there, then they're going to see like what's all out there for them to access in that navigation. They're going to click on it, get access denied likely. And so the audiences stuff can help that as well. So that's just another reason for Azure AD groups, because then you could use them in your navigation so that Bo as a guest, maybe I only see 5 things in the navigation, but as a tenant user, maybe I see 50 or whatever. And so audiences will help with that sort of stuff too, to prevent prying eyes poking around from your navigation. So
the menus are like security trimmed, so if you don't have access to it, you don't see it.
yeah, well, the nav will be security trimmed for the stuff on the site you're on, but with hub navigation, you're typically linking. I call it building bridges. So you're building a bridge from one site collection to another, and all that. And when you build those bridges, people know the bridges exist right now. So even though I don't have access to the leadership site, if that's in the navigation and it's another site, then I might be tempted to click on it, and then I find out I don't have access. And so audiences will be our way to help trim that down, to say, oh yeah, let's only show this link to this AD group, and we know that AD group is what's securing that site too. So
yeah, it seems like if you go outside of your hub, you can't security trim when you hop over to another hub. You're actually almost creating a link that doesn't pay attention to security. It's kind of a hard-coded link, and the audiences say, which hard-coded links do I want to hide? So they don't go to a place they don't have access to. I guess it would be nice if the links going across hubs would be security trimmed, and that way you wouldn't even have to use audiences if you want to keep them out of things that see.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. That's something that in the history of SharePoint has always been bad, is cross-site collection linking and having that security trimmed. It's been really good about, hey, I'm linking to something within my site and you don't have access to that, which back in the day, we used to have sites and subsites and all that sort of stuff. So that was really advantageous, because if I didn't have access to a subsite, then I didn't see the link to it. But now that the world is flat and we're more often than ever linking across site collections, I think that audience targeting stuff is more important. It would be awesome if it would trim a link, if it knew it was a link within this tenant and you don't have permission to the destination, it trimmed it. But I think that that's probably a very expensive operation for SharePoint people to do in the background, which is why they punted. Put the onus back on us now to say, you've got to create an audience for it and secure it yourself.
So it's interesting. It's just sort of going back to it's nice to see. So people have their intranets, more formal intranets, where it's more of like read only. Someone's providing access where people can get what's going on within the company. And what you're saying here with Teams, that's the place where maybe you're working together in a team that's trying to go get something done, and you have someone you need to work with outside the company. You're seeing that sort of as Teams is taking off, that's more of the place where people are getting external access to work with the people, outside the company, and that's sort of helping to provide a way for people outside your organization to work with you. So it's maybe not so much an extranet that they're going to access, but they're getting access to a team within your organization. Sort of like and I think what we do with clients as well, set up a team with them and we collaborate with them there. It sounds like that's sort of the extranet somewhat being replaced by Teams. It's sort of like the extranet is Teams. You give the access there, you work with the people there, but there's not like a formal, like you would have with an intranet that's a homepage, but more of like your teams as you're trying to get work done. Is that kind of summarize what you were saying, or any subtleties you would make with that?
I think everything you said is fair. Teams is probably the largest conduit of an extranet collaboration scenario that we've known and done before. Okay. I think the exception is if you have an intranet that you feel needs to be guest facing, and the scenario that probably comes to mind most is somebody who's a multi-tenant sort of company, where they have an intranet and they already have companies that are already in other tenants. Then that might be the scenario where guest access to your quote unquote intranet outside of Teams, which theoretically means it's an extranet, right? Because you're exposing it, but you're really exposing it to just tenants that are kind of well known to you. But the idea of an extranet that's sort of wide open to all your partners and all that kind of stuff is probably lessened, because it's more specific to a team, where you're going to collaborate with partner A and team A, and you're going to collaborate with partner B and team B. And it's not like this wide open intranet to those sort of scenarios, probably.
Cool. I could probably pick your brain. You were talking about anonymous access earlier. I have some questions about that, but let's just wrap it up with that. I think this is great information. I think this is a great subject. I think what's exciting to hear more about with this is with the whole concept of work together better. It really gets exciting when you see clients not just work inside their organization, but also outside their organization. And it's a lot. I mean, that's nowadays, that's the way that work gets done. And so enabling this through teams and enable, once we give them this access to work together, then we get to do all the fun stuff around workflows and all the, building apps with them that they're getting access to, all this great stuff that we can do on top of Office 365 sort of starts with this. And we're no longer talking about just staying inside the organization. I think that's the exciting thing for us in this upcoming year.
I started smiling because for some reason the way you said that made me think my developer plug would be if we build it in a SharePoint framework solution, then it's going to respect the SharePoint permissions, and then we don't have to worry about this whole guest thing or not. We just have to worry about, do you have SharePoint permission? That's
Gotcha.
just no.
That's good. That's good, right? I mean, we've had it before in the past where it was somebody didn't think through this, and we had to code to use cases that somebody didn't think about. It sounds like they've done a good job with that. The team has put together something well there, so that's great to hear.
Yeah, well, and that's actually what I had to do for the customer where I built the Power App, and then they said, oh yeah, we're gonna have 300 people that are guests accessing this, and I was like, okay, well I guess I have to do this as a SharePoint framework solution. I cried a little bit, but I was more happy.
Gotcha. Anything else, Tommy, before we wrap up?
No, sounds good. Enjoyed
this. Was great, Bo.
Some tech stuff from Bo. Makes me happy.
Thanks.
This was great, Bo. Thank you for taking the time to do this, and we really appreciate that. We'd love to we'll pull you in later on this year as we get in over our heads and find some different subjects where we feel like you could help out. But thank you for all the hard work that you put on projects. I think it's an exciting year. It's a good time to be at ThreeWill. It's a good time. I think just some of the projects we're taking on are pretty awesome. And we love having what you're doing and finding out what you're doing on these projects. So thanks for all that you do, Bo.
No problem. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks so much for listening and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.